And all I promise you today is that I will say my truth. I'm not so egotistical as to believe that I alone have the corner on the truth. If your truth is different than that, then I respect that. But I promise to give you my truth of ecological capitalism here this morning. I'm only going to hit the high points of a lot of different things. You know, you say if you want to know the details, then read the books. I've got a couple of them back there. I'm not out selling books, but if you want to get the details, get that. I want to deal with the big picture of ecological capitalism as I deal with it here. I talk here this morning. You know, change is usual. Change is always happening. We can always expect change. You know, that idea really started with an ancient Greek philosopher that I'll call Heraclitus. I don't know exactly how it's pronounced, but I'll call him that. But he was an ancient Greek, and he was the one that started the basic philosophy that change is central to the universe as a whole. It's always changing. And probably the more common modern term that we hear is that the only constant in life is change. But folks, you know, there are some changes that are not usual and constant. There are some changes that are unusual, and some changes that are abrupt and out of the ordinary. A fellow by the name of Peter Drucker, who was the consultant to 20th century capitalism across the country and the big corporations and practically invented the term business management. He made the observation in his book, Post-Capitalist Society. He said that every few hundred years in Western civilization, society goes through a great transformation. And he says within a short period of time that society basically rearranges itself. It changes its worldviews, its social and cultural values, its social and political institutions and structures, its arts, its institutions. Everything changes. And 50 years later, there's a new world. And he continued, he says, we're currently going through such a transformation. Not usual, constant, but a great transformation. I'm convinced that the transformation that we're in today is at least as great as the Industrial Revolution of some 200 and some years ago. I think it's probably as great as the beginning of science some 400 years ago in the late 1600s. What we're talking about here is something that's going to fundamentally change our life. It's going to change our whole concept of what economic development is about, what society is about. It's going to change our whole concept of what science is about, of how the world works and how we fit within it. I think that change is being driven by questions of sustainability. Sustainability is the big question. Sure, we've done all of this stuff, but can we sustain it? And I think there's growing evidence that the industrial paradigm of economic development and the capitalistic system that's been driving that paradigm, particularly for the last 25 to 50 years, quite simply is not sustainable. The industrial era is coming to an end. Now, we're not talking about, and no one would want to go back to the pre-industrial times because industrialization brought tremendous material benefits to people, and that was the greatest need of 200 years ago. Nobody wants to go back to the drudgery and the hard work and the deprivation and the hunger of the pre-industrial times. But I think there's growing evidence that whole era of material development, of material progress, is quite simply not sustainable. The questioning began in the 1960s with the environmental movement, when we come to realize that nature wasn't an endless sink in which we could dump all of the waste of the industrial society, and we were creating environmental problems that threatened human health and the integrity of the natural ecosystems. We concluded that nature was fundamentally incapable of absorbing all of the waste that we were dumping within. And then in the 1970s, we saw the rising energy prices for the first time, and we had to face the reality that this industrial era, which was based on fossil energy, and that was a finite source of fossil energy, and one of these days it was going to run out. Didn't run out then, but we're facing it again. And there's the other side of the depletion of fossil energy, and that's what Kelly Kane, the University of Wisconsin at River Falls, calls the evil twins. It's global climate change, and there's a direct linkage between the depletion of fossil energy and the threat to changes in global climate. peak oil, global climate change, the evil twins, if you will. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but peak oil is built on the premise that once an oil field is discovered, it takes about 30 to 40 years to bring it into peak production, and once you reach the peak, only about half of the oil has been depleted, but the rest of the oil, the other half, is more difficult to extract, more costly to extract, and production declines year after year as you finish up the oil field. And the total of oil production is just a summation of all of those oil discoveries and fields. If you look back to the U.S., our peak in discoveries in oil in this country was in the 30s and 40s with the discoveries in Oklahoma and Texas, and then some 30 to 40 years later in 1971 we had a peak in oil production in this country, and oil production has been declining ever since, and there's nothing we can do about it. The peak in global discoveries occurred in the early 1960s, and people are talking about global oil production peaking anywhere between 2005. Some say it's already happened in 2025, and there's disagreement, but there's general agreement that the peak is near, and after that it's less and less oil and more costly oil as we move into years ahead. And after the peak in oil, there'll be a peak in natural gas, and after that will be coal. And all of that's more expensive and more polluting than what come on before. And when we look at alternatives like wind and solar and water, all of those are lower in quantities that simply it's not the capacity there to generate it, and it's going to be more costly. The days of cheap energy are over. And as we look for alternatives for oil, such as coal, for example, then we run into the evil twin of climate change, because oil and other fossil energies are the other side of the depletion of fossil energy, because the energy that's depleted, or the energy that's embodied in fossil energy, whether it's coal or oil or whatever, was once collected by green plants, and those green plants took the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, other elements from the air and combined it with the nitrous, phosphorus, potash, and calcium and other things from the soil, and the energy is tied up in the bonds that hold all of those elements together, and when you take the energy out, you release all of that stuff, including the greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. There's no consensus, no 100% agreement on peak oil and climate change, but the scientific consensus, the predominance of scientific evidence, indicates that there are great cause for concern for the future of our society and humanity. There's great concern about the sustainability, because all questions of sustainability ultimately are questions about energy. Why is that? Because everything that we do that's any use to us is about energy. Our houses, our clothes, our cars, our food, all of those things require energy to make, require energy to use. In fact, all material things is simply concentrated energy. That's what Einstein's E equals mc squared was about. Energy equals matter times the speed of light squared. So it's all about energy. Even the human usefulness, our thinking, our working, our creative minds, it's all about energy. We have to have energy. We have to have biological energy to fuel this body. It's all about energy. In addition to that, in order to make humans productive, we're born as helpless little babies. We have to be nurtured. We have to be educated, socialized, civilized, and all of that takes energy. So it's all about energy, whatever we do. Now, the first law of thermodynamics says that energy is neither created or destroyed, so you might think we can just use it and use it over and over again. But the second law says every time that we use energy, some of the usefulness is lost. Why is that? Because whenever we use energy, it always changes in form, and it always changes in a specific way. It goes from a more concentrated, organized form to a more dissipated, disorganized form, like when you explode gasoline in the cylinder of a car. And it's that explosion, that a tendency of energy when disturbed to disperse, that drives the piston, that drives the car down the road. It's that dispersion that fuels our bodies with food. You could use that energy over again. You didn't destroy it, but it's less concentrated, less organized, and therefore it's less useful. So no matter how efficiently we get in recycling, renewing, conserving, we're inevitably moving toward entropy. We're depleting the usefulness of the energy that's there. We're destroying the ability of the planet to support life or anything else, no matter what we do. The only source of energy to offset the loss of usefulness that's inevitably lost to entropy is solar energy. That's the only sustainable source. Nobody has an idea how we have sustainability after the sun burns out, but we've got a few billion years to work on that. So the best source of sustainable energy today is solar energy. You know, entropy, this whole concept, is be academic. Maybe you still think it's so, and it was, as long as there was plenty of cheap energy around. and as long as there was plenty of places to dump the waste from the depletion of the energy. It wasn't a big concern. And that characterized basically the whole industrial era up to about 50 years ago. Plenty of cheap energy, plenty of places to dump it. So we didn't think much about it. The whole industrial area was funded by cheap energy or supported by cheap energy. First, it was the old growth forest that had been growing for 100 years, and then it was the coal that was laying on the surface of the land, and then it was the oil that you punch a hole in the ground that came out as a gusher. But folks, we cut all the old growth forest, and all of the surface coal is gone, and now we're having to move mountains to get to a little bit of coal, and all of that easy oil is not there. And we're talking about going out where we go miles down to the ocean floor before we drill miles into the ocean floor to get the energy out from the oil. It's all gone. And there's no place left to dump the waste into the atmosphere or into the land or into the ocean, even if we had the energy out there. The industrial era is coming to an end. It's over, folks. The critical questions associated with industrialization are even more critical and more relevant when we link industrialization up with capitalism, the neoclassical concept of capitalism. Well, I'll explain the difference here in a minute. When you put that together, it's a critical source because it accelerates this process of entropy. Why is that? Because there's no economic incentive to collect and store solar energy for the benefit of society as a whole or for the benefit of the future of humanity. That's what makes this neoclassical industrial economy so efficient. It doesn't waste energy on anything that doesn't meet the individual material needs of society at this particular time, thus as individuals rather than society as a whole. Why is that? Because economic value is inherently individualistic in nature. All economic value accrues to the individual. There's nothing in economics about the value of relationships or ethics or morality or any of that. That's left to something else. Economics is about meeting our individual material well-being. And if you think about it then, if economic value is individualistic, it says that at the very least, whenever we make a decision, that we have to, if it's an economic decision, we have to expect the benefit of that decision to at least accrue to us during our lifetime. It makes absolutely no economic sense to invest in something for the sole benefit of someone else other than you, and certainly not someone else of some unknown future generations. And the more and more our society is driven by that, the more and more we can create the lack of sustainability moving toward entropy. This is not just a philosophical point. If you look in the markets and you have to pay interest rates, the interest rates are there. That's a reflection of our individual preference for the present relative to the future, because the future is always uncertain. Even if we wait till tomorrow to get something, we may not be here, or we may not be able to enjoy it. That's reflected in interest rates. If you want to borrow money from somebody so you can have something today rather than wait for it, you're going to have to pay them interest. Let's say at an interest rate of 7%, you're going to have to pay them 7% per year to use their money rather than allowing them to use it. And if you've got the money and you give it to somebody else, you're going to want interest from it because you have to give up the consumption of that. And that's just a part of our individual well-being, and it's ingrained within us. And an interest rate of 7%, if you have to wait, make an investment and wait 10 years for it, it's only worth 50 cents on the dollar today, because if you invested that dollar at 7%, it'd be worth, 50 cents, it'd be worth $1 10 years from now. And that's just the economic reality. And folks, when we see the markets now, the economy responding to energy supplies and energy shortages and things like that, it's responding to the current scarcity. Its impact on individual well-being. It's not responding to the ultimate depletion or to climate change. The economy simply will not, from everything we know about the nature of society and everything we know about the nature of natural ecosystem, the economy will not ensure sustainability. In fact, it will ensure exactly the opposite if we left it under constraint. It makes no sense, no economic sense, to invest in anything for the good of society as a whole, other people that we don't get anything back from, or for the benefit of the future. And the thing we need to realize is that all economic value either comes from nature, natural ecosystems, minerals, or comes from society, working, creating whatever. The economy itself creates no value. It simply translates the value that's inherent in those resources into something we can trade in the marketplace. And when we've depleted all of the usefulness of nature and all of the usefulness of society, which we are doing, There's no place else to get any economic value. This economy, this society, quite simply, is not sustainable. Industrial capitalism is not sustainable. The industrial era is over. The great transformation that will be required, whether we accept it or not, is going to happen. It will require a fundamental change in thinking, a fundamental change in thinking about how the world works and how we as humans fit within it. Albert Einstein, one of the smartest men and most wisest men of our time, once said that you can't solve a problem using the same kind of thinking that you were using when you created it. The thinking that created these problems is a particular kind. It has a mechanistic worldview that goes back to Sir Isaac Newton and René Descartes and a few other people back 400 years ago, and they perceived the world as a big machine. It's a big mechanistic process, and we as individuals are nothing but cogs in this big machine that can be taken apart and put back together and analyzed and so on. A sustainable worldview, a sustainable world will require a fundamentally different approach to thinking as the world as a big biological organism. That's the ecological thinking. The only things that are sustainable are those things that are living biological systems. And the change in that thinking from the mechanistic worldview and we as the cogs to the ecological worldview and we as being integrally interrelated with all of the other living and non-living things will require a fundamental change in everything in our life. We have to rearrange ourselves as a society. We have to rethink our values and restructure our political systems and governments and our economy. And there'll be changes in our arts, in our institutions. And we will have to create a fundamentally new and different world. Going back to this new world, why do we need an ecological worldview? If you go back to the concept of entropy, I explained the process of entropy, but this ultimate state of entropy is defined as a state of the degradation of the usefulness of matter and energy, a state that's characterized by uniformity, the lack of form, of pattern, of structure, of differentiation. If you think about the surface of the moon or Mars, that's about as close as any of us have seen to systems where all of the life has been extracted, all of the usefulness has been extracted. Homogeneity, no form, no structure, no hierarchy. The industrial system with its specialization, its standardization, its consolidation of hierarchical control, which characterize not just energy, not just the economy, but our institutions, our schools, our churches, our civic organizations, everything standardized, specialized, consolidate. Decide who's in charge. It's a system that depletes, that moves us toward that state of entropy, which is a state of lifelessness. The alternative of sustainability, I said, is about living systems, because living systems are fundamentally different than that. They're not separable, they're holistic, they're diverse. It's not homogeneous. It's interdependent, mutually beneficial relationships. And it's those kind of systems that are capable of capturing the solar energy that we have to restore and regenerate the energy that's lost to entropy over time. Living systems use that solar energy to restore the structure, to restore the pattern, the hierarchy, the differentiation. They move away from entropy rather than toward it. It's fundamentally important. No living individual lives forever. Most of you that are getting up to my age, you know that very well. Some of the young people haven't thought much about that yet. So the individual living thing is not sustainable, but the community of living things is. And living things have this capacity and the inherent tendency to regenerate and renew the species and even invest in the next generation, even if people don't have children of their own. And that's what we talk about, that the communities of living things are capable of regeneration and renewal and sustainability over the long run, because they're capable of capturing that solar energy. We as humans, we're solar energy collectors. We just use windmills and water and photovoltaic cells and all of that sort of thing. But see, we depend on biological energy, so we're having to use biological energy to do all that. And even more important, that as we build the windmills and the photovoltaic cells, it takes energy to build those structures, to put those structures in place. We can't just consume all of that energy. We've got to set it aside and invest in new generations of windmills and water power and photovoltaic cells and things of that nature. We have to have this human capacity to divert some of the energy from current consumption to the benefit of society as a whole and the benefit of the future generation. And probably the most undervalued is our responsibility of investing in the future of society. in the civility, the ability of people to get along together, the kindness and trust in the relationships, because if we don't regenerate that social energy, we'll simply use the physical energy to destroy the universe and the world that's within it. Sustainability requires an ecological understanding of the world. Ecological understanding. If you look in the dictionary of places on ecology, they'll probably talk about it's a branch of biology that deals with the relationships between living things and their natural environment. And then you'll see human ecology, which deals with relationships between human and the natural environment. There's social ecology, which deals with social relationships, or they'll talk about a harmony in relationships among people and between people and their environment. Sustainability requires all of those interpretations of ecology. That is very fundamental foundation. It requires a realization and a respect for the first principle of ecology, which is everything's interconnected. You can't do just one thing. Everything you do affects everything else, and we're a part of that whole that we're affecting. We are connected with that. And the economy is interconnected with the society, it's interconnected with nature, and all of that's part of an interconnected whole, and we have to recognize that. And there are certain fundamental principles that I'll talk about more next time, but I'm just going to mention here for sake of time. But we respect kind of those common sense principles of how nature works. Natural biological systems, if you want to pick out some principles or characteristics that are simple and fundamental, as I mentioned before, nature is holistic, diverse, and interdependent. It isn't just a collection of things. The relationships matter. Diversity is essential. And if we talk about social relationships, the relationships within society that create a productive and sustainable society, then we have to talk about things that Greg talked about of honesty, fairness, compassion, responsibility, respect. You can put those together in principles of trust. Honesty, fairness, responsibility. Build relationships of trust. When trusts are validated, the relationships grows. When trusts are violated, the relationships are destroyed. It's basically common sense. Sometimes we need mercy more than we need fairness, and we have to have kindness in relationships, compassion and respect. And we have to have the courage to stand up for those principles, which is not easy. And we have to respect the economic principles. That's how we meet our individual material needs. We are individual material beings, and that's important. This is not the only important thing. We respect the value of scarcity that I mentioned before, because economic value is about scarcity, not the intrinsic value of something, but whether or not it's scarce. And we have to use our resources efficiently. That's an economic principle, the output relative to the input. And economic sovereignty is the one that's not respected much, but we have to take responsibility of making our own decisions and the responsibility that's associated with those decisions. And finally, ecology is about integrity, the ecological worldview. That means that all of those principles have to permeate everything. The economic principles have to be reflected in nature and society, and the ecological principles have to be reflected again in the economy and in society, and the social principles have to be reflected in our relationship with nature. You know, if we're honest and fair and respectful of other people, we'll take care of nature. We won't pollute their environment and their water. And if we're responsible for those of future generations, then we won't deplete their resources. We need to reflect those principles, and as I say, we'll talk about them more, but they're basically common sense. You know, many question today whether or not we can ever constrain this capitalistic system that we built to make it sustainable. And I have to admit, you know, that the risks that they're talking about are really real. But I'm not a communist or a socialist or a fascist or whatever. I've been accused of all of those things, but I'm not. I don't think there's ever been any other system that's devised that even comes close to capitalism in meeting our individual material needs. And the other system has tried and failed, and the people reject it because it simply couldn't meet their individual material needs as well as the alternative. But that's not the only alternative that we're talking about. Those individual needs are important and they're legitimate, and we need to have a capitalistic economy. We can talk a lot about what we need to do to make it really truly function capitalistic, but we need to have that to meet those material needs. But I agree with the skeptics that an unbridled neoclassical version of capitalism, which we've been practicing basically for the last 25 or 30 years, quite simply is not sustainable, and it's very dangerous for the future of humanity. But the classical economists, the classical capitalists, so to speak, of Smith and Malthus and Ricardo and those that the economists quote, that was a very different view. Those people understood the importance that an economy had to function within the context of a moral and socially just society. And without those constraints, it would not function for the greater good of society as a whole. Adam Smith, for example, in his Wealth of Nations, he talked about should not be considered an inconvenience for those in better positions or higher classes within society to take care of the lower ranks for society, because what was good for the better part of the whole was good for the whole as a whole. He understood social responsibility. He talked about land being his terms for the natural resources out there as being the most durable, most sustainable, dependable wealth of any nation. And he said that the people had to take responsibility together through government to take care of that commonwealth. He understood that. Classical capitalism was about ethical and moral constraints that you put on an economy so that it would function for the greater good of society as a whole. The people that wrote the Constitution and the founders of this country is about in the same days as Adam Smith. In fact, Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, and as Greg talked about before, they understood the purpose of government. When they talked about those inalienable rights, the part right after that in the Declaration of Independence, it says, to ensure these rights, governments are instituted among men, they said men, gaining their just authority from the consent of the governed. They understood that when they wrote the Constitution. They understood it was the responsibility of government to provide the moral and just constraints or boundaries within which the individual could function in their self-interest. It's only within the past few decades that we've abandoned this in our pursuit of individual material self-interest, and we've turned it upside down. If it doesn't get in the way of the economy, then we'll be just and we'll be ethical. But if they have to compromise our ethics or our social values to improve economic growth, we willingly do so. Rights of future generations was not addressed in our Constitution because I don't think they realized that we could deplete the resources, but it's certainly there. We could do it within the Constitution. In fact, the 5th article of the Constitution is about how the Constitution is to be changed and amended. Amendments, constitutional conventions, they understood that the Constitution should be a living document. As we understood more about how the world worked and how we fit within it, then we needed to go back and re-examine that document periodically to reestablish the consent of the governed. All we have to do, the good news, all we have to do to create a sustainable ecological economy is to restore the fundamental principles of classical capitalism and classical democracy. Nothing new, nothing big. We're not going back to earlier times, but those principles that are there are timeless. But constitutional change requires the consent of the governed. It can't be imposed upon people. It has to evolve from people, which means that we have to abandon this narrow individual pursuit of our material self-interest, not abandoning it totally, but recognize that we also have to invest in the greater common good of society, and we have to fulfill our responsibilities to future generations. How will we ever get around to doing that? By returning again to our basic common sense. Sure, we're individual material well-beings, and we need food, clothing, and shelter, but we're also social beings. We need relationships with other people, regardless of whether we get anything in return. And it makes our life better when we have friendships and families and communities. It's not a sacrifice. And we're ethical and moral beings, and we need some sense of purpose and meaning in life. We need something that tells us what's right and wrong. And there's value in our rightness of our relationship with each other, and our relationships with the earth, and our relationships to those of future generations. Those things are not sacrifice. We need to balance our individual with our social and our ethical well-being. This isn't new thinking. Aristotle talked about it in defining happiness. Alex talked about it as self-interest, rightly understood as the foundation of democracy. The Dalai Lama talks about it as being wisely selfish if we choose to be selfish. This isn't new stuff. In fact, sustainability is about going back to the basic golden rule, which isn't just religion, it's in every major enduring philosophy. It says that we should simply treat other people as we would be treated, other people within society today as we would have them treat us if we were among the unfortunate. And to transcend that across generations and to do for those of future generations as we would have them do for us if we were of that generation and they were here today. That's not radical. It's fundamental. That's all we really need to do, folks. A new ecological understanding that we're interconnected with all of the other stuff. We have to obey the laws and the principles of nature and the laws, the natural law of human relationship, and then we'll have a more desirable, happy quality of life. The change we're going through today is not the usual constant change. It's something big and something important. An old age is dying and a new age is being born. The good news is that we can go through this transformation and that on the other side, life will be fundamentally better. But folks, time is running out. We've got to get busy and do it. Thank you.